Superhero costumes is an important part of creating a lasting character. You want something iconic, eye-catching, and hopefully unique. You also want it to match the character's motif or theme if possible. Never forget the Batman costume that could have been. Now some characters have costumes that land right out the gate, and so they've changed very little over time, just some variations on a theme. While others have gone through some massive changes, or they've just had multiple costumes. This can lead to both some interesting costumes and some interesting moments related to them. In the Golden Age, the rise of the popularity of superheroes in that specific genre led to a time period where the Sandman had the same costume as Tarantula. And yes, there was a Golden Age Sandman. He was Wesley Dodds. I say that because I made a community post about them doing some new Golden Age series, new time of recording, 2023, and some people were unaware that there was a Golden Age Sandman. There was. He also had a really hardcore 90s series. Now these two costumes are nearly identical. Spot the difference territory. The similarities were so strong that years later, DC Comics in canon would try to explain just how this happened. You know, for the 12 people asking. Myself included. So just what happened and how did they explain this? I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and I hope you like yellow and purple because we're about to see a lot of it. Now the Sandman didn't start off in yellow and purple, although he did still have a lot of colors, it just wasn't those. He first debuted in 1939 in both New York World's Fair Comics #1 and later that same year within the span of a few weeks in Adventure Comics 40. He had a very pulpy design, a fedora-like hat, a suit, a gas mask. He did have a cape and he was fairly brightly colored, but it was still distinct from the superhero costumes of the time. It was leaning more towards being a pulp costume. That genre had been in vogue at the time, but the 1940s saw the rise of the superhero within the comic book genre. The early 40s, because they would fade out of popularity in the late 40s post-war. The Sandman's early stories had some pulp traits and some superhero traits. He solved mysteries, but he had a secret identity, and he had a gimmicky weapon in his sleep gas gun. But his tales were also a bit more gritty, and he had a female companion who was essentially his equal. Before that role would be supplanted by a kid sidekick, because that's what was popular thanks to Robin. He debuted in Detective Comics 38 in 1940. Now it seems as though the Sandman stories were forced to respond to the popularity of the evolving superhero genre, because abruptly in Adventure Comics 69 in December of 1941, we have the story The Sandman and the Case of the Giant Bees.
No, not the bees! Not the bees!
In this story, suddenly Wesley Dodds has a new costume that the text itself describes as glamorous. He also meets a young boy named Sandy, who says that he is dressed like him because he admires him and so he pretends to be him. Only his costume is yellow and red instead of yellow and purple. I guess he couldn't get any purple fabric that day. So the Sandman met an obsessed cosplayer. Yay. But Sandy is useful, and by the end of that issue the two team up, so the Sandman too can have a child sidekick. Now this story was by Mort Weisinger with art by Paul Norris, and a few issues later in issue 73, the Sandman stories would be taken over by Jack Kirby as writer and artist with Joe Simon on inks. And they would lean ever harder into the superhero style. In fact, part of why they were there was to help revitalize the Sandman. There was great excitement surrounding their coming because they had successfully created Captain America over at Timely Comics, before Timely was Atlas and then Marvel. They even collected this era. They had a whole collection that was just the Jack Kirby and Joe Simon run on the Sandman. And you have to say the first one, because they came back in the 70s with another. This was a different Sandman, but he had a very similar costume, but a different backstory. Also, the creative team was more varied in this, and it landed quite differently. It didn't last very long. There was also a very awkward Wonder Woman tie-in. Now on the surface, making these changes to the Sandman back in the 40s makes sense. He was a decently popular character, so why not try and ensure his survival? And the best way to do that was by having him take on attributes of what was popular and selling at the time. It's a bit funny now, because in hindsight, what makes him more unique is that original design with the gas mask. That's what people go back to. That's the iconic look. So it really depends when people are coming to a work, because now all of that pulp stuff has much more of a nostalgic vibe than the superhero stuff. However, even if one was a fan of the new costume for the Sandman, it was not unique. He was not the only person wearing this costume. Somebody else had donned the purple mask, cape, and yellow bodysuit with purple strongman pants ensemble. And that character was the Tarantula, aka Jonathan Law. He debuted in Star Spangled Comics #1 in October of 1941. Now we have our cover dates for both of the appearances of these costumes, but either way, Star Spangled Comics appears to come first, so it would be Sandman taking Tarantula's look. But even if it's the other way, they're extremely close together, and it's the exact same costume. The Sandman will eventually lose the cape, but that will be the only difference. The Tarantula had a very solid Golden Age origin. He was very fleshed out compared to some other characters we've looked at on this channel. Right out the gate, everything you needed is set down, and he even has a personality. He's a mystery novelist who got so enthused by his subject matter that he had to try his hand at being a mystery man himself. He just got really into it, he got enthralled. So he studied and learned, then eventually decided that he too could try his hand at this. And so he could insert himself into the narratives he was writing in a way. But why? For 9 years I've been writing a lot of stories about crime busting. Tonight, I've just begun to practice what I've been writing about. In my last book, The dozen masterminds. I thought up enough stunts for thwarting big shots like Ace Deuce to keep me going a long time in actual practice. I'm sorry, I can't say the name Ace Deuce without laughing a little bit. A pet tarantula. From it came the idea for the century's most sensational crime blaster. Crime blaster, not crime fighter. He's gonna blast the crime. And you little guy, if it hadn't been for you, your webs, your sticky feet, your tricks with insects, I'd never have thought of becoming Tarantula. Hey, at least a tarantula didn't fly through his window, or crawl through, I guess. Now I know tarantulas can come in some vivid colors, particularly blues, but I don't think about yellow and purple when I think about tarantulas. Mostly brown. Side note, the tarantula swings through the city with his web gun, which he also uses to web up criminals. He had suction cups on his feet so he could walk on the ceiling, and the story calls him Spider-Man a few times. So there have been some debates of, did Spider-Man copy the tarantula? Well, company-wise at DC, particularly when they were using the tarantula in the 80s, they just used to joke around about it. Parallel thought or theft, you decide. The Sandman also started swinging through the city post-costume change. What is he swinging on? Dreams, hopes and dreams. So the tarantula story, Ace Deuce, was written by Mort Weisinger, but with art by Harold Sharp. The executive editor for both of these stories was Whitney Ellsworth. So I find it hard to believe that nobody behind the scenes noticed that these two characters had the exact same costume, particularly when they came out at around the exact same time. I can believe that nobody cared though. The tarantula stayed in that costume for all the issues he appeared in Star Spangled Comics, which was up to issue 19. But years later, for those who remember, the question lingered. And in All-Star Squadron 66, DC gave an in-canon answer. And also in issue 18, but that one doesn't have a cool tarantula cover. All-Star Squadron debuted in the 80s, 1981 to be exact, in Justice League of America 193. The series itself took place in the 1940s and involved a whole lot of retconning and inserting of storylines backwards. It actually had to answer questions about Dodds' costume changes a couple of times. And yes, they were always far more dramatic than he just realized that it looked better. Although miles may vary. If one prefers superhero costumes, they may be going for that yellow and purple look. In that same year, 1981, All-Star Squadron would get its own book featuring many Golden Age heroes and some who DC had not owned at the time of the actual Golden Age, but was now using in stories because they did own them now. And their narratives were also said to be taking place at the same time. They were playing with all of that. The series was created by Roy Thomas, Rich Buckler, and Jerry Ordway. And now on to issue 66, which was released in 1987. This story was The Origin of the Tarantula. It was written by Roy Thomas with art by Alan Cooperberg and inks by Tony DeZuniga. Colors Carl Gafford. Now All-Star Squadron had already shown that the tarantula had shown up wearing the same costume as the Sandman. It had acknowledged this. It really didn't have to, but it did. It could have just ignored it, but All-Star Squadron wasn't a series that did that. It is a nice bit of accuracy and rewarding for longtime readers or those who are up on their classic comic history. Issue 66 retells mostly Star Spangled Comics #1, but also pulls a decent amount from All-Star Squadron 18. It skips the story about the bees for the Sandman. Missing out. So what is the answer? Well, it expands upon Johnny's occupation. Also, look at some of these book titles that Johnny has written. How much do you think it's killing him inside that when he's out being a vigilante, he can't make jokes about how they're being captured by Johnny Law? A lot of what follows is from issue 18 of All-Star Squadron, some of it verbatim, but it's more expanded upon here. But still, this story did tell the tarantula's origins twice. In order to make all of this work, firstly they expand the depth of Johnny Law's interest in mystery men. They extended to him researching them and specifically taking an interest in the Sandman. The last summer I had a chance to see the Sandman in action one night, and what can I say? I was hooked. They also add that he now collected spiders since childhood. Not that he just has a random tarantula, even though he does still kind of just have a random tarantula. He picks it up and talks to it. It's not that weird. It's just the way they panel it makes it look really melodramatic. Now his interest in the Sandman leads to him interviewing the Sandman's known associates. People that he goes on adventures with, which includes Diane Belmont, the Sandman's long-standing love interest and a cool character in her own right. And so I began to work on two ideas simultaneously. One of the less practical involved my becoming a hooded crime buster myself. Oh man, not a crime blaster? And mentally, I was already thinking of using a spider motif. The second led me a couple of weeks later to a visit from the local DA's daughter, Diane Belmont. I'm pleased you like my little sketch, Mr. Law. Too bad the Sandman, the man you asked me here to talk about, doesn't feel like wearing that new costume I designed for him. Some guys are funny that way, Miss Belmont. Still, I appreciate you giving me the interview and all. How could I resist contributing to a book by Jonathan Law about these masked heroes who are popping up all over? Especially since the Sandman was one of the first right on the heels of the Crimson Avenger. Glad you believed me when I told you I have no interest in trying to learn any secrets you can't reveal, let alone the Sandman's true identity. But it's common knowledge you've been involved with him on several shall we say, capers, as was that Playboy friend of yours, Wesley Dodds. Too bad I wasn't able to reach him for an appointment too. He was too busy being a millionaire Playboy like everybody else. Sandman Mystery Theater really does a lot with Wesley Dodds and really plays with that trope and flips it on his head and makes him very different. It's worth reading. Anyways, thanks for your time, and here's your sketch. Why don't you keep it, Mr. Law? Call it just a hunch, but I suspect you'll make better use of it than the Sandman ever will. So this is where he gets his costume, since he's already pretty much made up his mind to try his hand at being a masked man, a crime buster. Nay, crime blaster. I refuse to let it die. Crime blaster, blast that crime. But when he goes out to stop some Nazis, he runs into the Sandman, and they're wearing the exact same costume, which is very confusing for the villains they're taking down. Only when those Nazis were hung out to dry that I get a chance to say something to my benefactor. Sandman, I guess I don't have to tell you how glad I am you showed up, but how come you're in that outfit? And who's that inside what's left of your roadster? Now what was going on here was that the Sandman and Diana were on a case together. She was in his original costume, and so he was in this, so that they could be two places at once kind of thing. Now, Diana apparently dies here, which is really a recounting of All-Star Squadron 18, but they retcon her death later on, which is good because it wasn't the greatest death, and her and the Sandman together are just chef's kiss. So this, the two of them being together in the same costume, is supposed to take place just a little bit before the Tarantula's first adventure, the Ace Deuce story. And so he does that, then he meets the Squadron, which they already established in earlier stories, wearing this costume, then his costume gets torn, and so his housekeeper Olga makes him the new one. I was about to say the better one, and I was like, I need to calm down on bashing the first costume. But we can definitely say that the second one is way more on theme. So because they retcon the death in the story, later on they'd have to say that the Wesley Dodds Sandman just adopted that new brighter costume because he was convinced that would make him appear friendlier and more approachable. So your friendly neighborhood Sandman. Look at how many explanations they had to come up with just to explain this little thing, these little changes of costume. I mean, they didn't have to come up with them, but it's interesting that they did. It's taking so much more effort than the actual switches themselves did. Now I can see why filling in this gap, answering this question, would be appealing to fans of that earlier era. But as to the why these two had the same costume in the first place from a behind the scenes perspective, I couldn't really nail it down. I did read some very interesting interviews with Joe Simon, Jack Kirby, but I couldn't really find anything from Mort Weisinger and the like talking about why they did this. If you can and you have the magical quotes, please let me know, because you know that I want to read them dramatically. There was a lot of reusing of things going on back in the early Golden Age. The Tarantula was also the name of an early villain that the Sandman fought, but Johnny Law had nothing to do with that. Creators of the time seemed pretty willing to reuse certain concepts. For example, in our last video, time for recording, about the Spider, we discussed his origin in the Golden Age. He was created by Paul Gustafson and named Thomas Halloway, which was the same name as the Timely Comics character Angel, who debuted in Marvel Comics #1 in 1939, so a year before the Spider over at Quality and Crack Comics. And just like this instance, they share a creator. Reading comics was different in the 1940s. That's not to say no one would have noticed, but it doesn't seem to have come up in the same way. Just the evolution of how and where you get comics, the changes in the technology that allow you to be able to go back and look at all this information and find all these things out / collect them in huge chunks. A lot has changed. So it really may just have been a case of making the costume, putting it on, and it's too similar, take the cape off, whatever. But I do hope that there's some juicy quotes that maybe I just missed. If I was remiss and couldn't find them, please share. You know I love to hear your stories. We have such a wide breadth of demographics on this channel, and that makes it so exciting to see the comments. But as it stands, I thought I would share that this happened and the canonical explanations that they came up with to explain it. What do you think the reason was why they initially had the same costume? Or do you know? What do you think of the in-canon explanation? Do you like it, or would you have left it alone? Or would you have come up with something else entirely? Share all your thoughts down below. While you're down there, please do all the YouTube things. Like, share, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you never miss a vid. Thanks so much for taking some time today spent discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. If the Tarantula and the Sandman don't have to be on color brand, then neither do I. See you again soon. Bye-bye.